Thank you. It's a true pleasure to introduce Dave Loewensteiner. Actually, no need to introduce Dave because everybody knows him. He's been around for a while. You've been working at CDU for what, a couple of years?
I was at CDU for about 2, yeah.
Yeah, 2 years. And this is before he got headhunted by Supervising Scientists, stole Dave from us. Yeah, so Dave is from the US originally, and he's completed his studies, undergrad and postgrad studies at Florida Tech. Florida Tech, is that right? Yeah, in marine biology.
Yep.
And then he spent many years at the University of Maryland, where he's been involved in developing environmental sensors, monitoring systems, and particularly in marine environments. Yeah.
Yep.
And then Jane and Dave decided to come to Darwin. And that's, I think, when your love story with drones started, right?
Yes.
That's when you started working, I think you took a position in Hamish's lab,
yep,
working on drones.
Yep.
And then after that, you got this job at Supervising Scientist, so the federal government. How many, it's been, what, 2 years already?
2.5, yeah.
Yeah.
Just over 2.
All right. So today you'll be telling us a little bit more about drones.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dave.
Thanks, Clem. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I did work with underwater drones for a long time in the US. And one of the reasons I think that I ended up working with airborne aerial drones when I arrived here is that Hamish was looking at my resume and I had put AUV, which is autonomous underwater vehicle. And I think that he had confused it with UAV, which is unmanned aerial vehicle. And he called me up and I said, oh, I can fly one of those too. So here we are. So the title of my talk is a multi-scale approach to monitoring and assessing ecosystem restoration. In this case, it's at Ranger Uranium Mine, which we'll be talking about a fair bit. I use the phrase a multi-scale approach because in this case, we're talking about ecosystem restoration and people have varied views on what ecosystem restoration means, what it looks like, how do you assess it, how do you monitor it, how do you measure it? Is it something you can go look at and say, yep, that's a restored ecosystem, or that's not a restored ecosystem? Where do you begin? You know, you have everything from genes to higher trophic levels and everywhere in between, and all the biochemical and geophysical processes that are occurring in a functioning ecosystem. So the approach that I've sort of taken to thinking about this is through what I could just call a multi-scale approach, is trying to measure things at as sort of many different scales as we can to give us a more cohesive picture of what these ecosystems are doing as they're rehabilitated or restoring to some state. So just start off with acknowledgements. I'll go backwards in this talk. I'll pay respects to the traditional owners of Kakadu National Park, Arnhem Land, and the Darwin region, where we conduct our research and monitoring, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to thank the Northern Australian Resources Hub, the graphics library, for a few bits and pieces that are in this talk. So I'll give you just a quick sort of overview of who the supervising scientist is and who ERIS is, which is an acronym that you might hear get thrown around locally. The supervising scientist is sort of is an entity. There's approximately 40 employees there at the current moment. And underneath the supervising scientists, there are a few different branches or a few different sort of pieces. And one of those is a group called ERIS, which is the Environmental Research Institute of the Supervising Scientists. So as the name implies, it's an environmental research institute that does research into environmental science. The specific role of the supervising scientist at its highest level is to ensure protection of the Alligator Rivers region from the effects of uranium mining. So the Alligators River region is Kakadu National Park and a large portion of West Arnhem Land, give or take. Uranium mining has occurred in those, or uranium was first discovered in those places in the 1950s and 60s. There was small scale mining that occurred mostly in the southern parts of Kakadu National Park down near Gunlam, and a variety of mines happened there. In the 1970s, large deposits were discovered in the northern parts of the park and in the northern, what is now the northern parts of the park in Arnhem Land. And in 1979, there was culminated in a report called the Fox Report, which was put out to which basically recommended that uranium mining be allowed to proceed under very specific guidelines. As part of the deal, the government and the traditional owners came together to create Kakadu National Park, as well as allow for the uranium mining to proceed in the region. And that kicked off sort of 40 plus years of uranium mining and at Ranger Uranium Mine and at a few other sites, which I'll talk about today. So what we do at sort of at a day-to-day level, we undertake environmental research and develop standards and practices for environmental protection specific to uranium mining in the region. We research the environmental effects of uranium mining and uranium mine rehabilitation, and we research uranium mine rehabilitation. How do you do it? What does it look like? What does success look like? We supervise and provide oversight of mining operations and to ensure compliance. So the mining company, the operators say, this is what we're going to do. These are our plans. They have to go show us that that's what they've done. They've complied with their water quality regulations, et cetera. We assess mine plans and verify mining activities as a result of that. And finally, we have a role to provide public assurance and advice to both ministers, regulators, stakeholders, such as various NGOs and the general public. So let's talk about Ranger. Everyone always talks about Ranger, but it's the focus of our work and has been for a long time. It's 250 k's southeast of Darwin. It's in the, I'll show a map later of the overview of it, but it's not in Kakadu National Park, but it's located in the far northeastern corner of Kakadu, next to the town of Jabiru, if you've been out there, just past the town. The mine opened in 1980. It ceased operations in January of this year. Over the course of its life, it produced 132,000 tons of uranium ore. That amounts to about 3% of global production as of today. Legislatively, it's required to complete major rehabilitation works by 2026. That means the site needs to be secured, holes need to be filled in, capped off, all the infrastructure needs to be decontaminated and dealt with appropriately, and trees and shrubs and plants need to be in the ground and starting their life. Its footprint is about 1,200 hectares of sort of disturbed footprint. So there's 800 hectares of that are sort of ground up, will be ground up restoration. So it's going to be a bare rock surface that trees and plants will be put into. The other 400 acres hectares have sort of some light, not light, but a range of disturbances, but they do contain sort of native vegetation. It's owned by Energy Resources. The mine is owned and operated by Energy Resources of Australia, and Rio Tinto is the majority shareholder currently. So, ecological restoration at Ranger, what does that mean? As part of that agreement in 1979, part of the legislation that was put in place, there are a set of environmental requirements that were put in place for the operation of the mine, but in this case, because the mine is closing, we're talking about what does it mean? What are the environmental requirements to essentially close the mine and walk away from the site? Those environmental requirements they align with the aspirations of the Mirarr traditional owners who are the traditional owners of that area. And there's a whole list of these environmental requirements, but there's two that are quite quite specific to Ranger, or sorry, to ecosystem restoration. And that's the first one, which is to establish an environment similar to the adjacent areas of Kakadu National Park, such that the rehabilitated area could be incorporated into Kakadu. The second one is revegetation of the disturbed sites of the Ranger project area should use local native plant species similar in density and abundance to those existing in adjacent areas of Kakadu National Park, to form an ecosystem, the long-term viability of which would not require a maintenance regime significantly different from appropriate areas adjacent in the park. So I just highlight those terms, long-term viability, because that's a key component of sort of ecosystem resilience, and the ongoing management of the park is obviously something that people talk about and think about regularly, but at least we have a benchmark there. So down the line of what does that management regime look like for this rehabilitated ecosystem. So like I said, that legislative mandate is to restore the site similar to the surrounds of Kakadu National Park. Through a series of stakeholder engagements, including the supervising scientist, the mine operator, traditional owners, it's been decided that a savanna woodland ecosystem is the restoration goal for the majority of the site. And I mean, that was primarily what was there previously, but there are some sort of changes in the types of vegetation that were there in terms of the amount of riparian areas. And you know, there was formerly a billabong on the site that is not going to be returned to the site. So essentially, we need to go from this picture on the left to eventually looking something like this. The time frame for that is a large question mark in terms of when that could look like that. But that's the goal. So just to sort of focus in a little closer, like I said, you know, you can see on the top left, that's where we are. Kakadu is in green. On the right, you can see where Ranger is located. And on the bottom map, we have in the light green is the mining lease, and in the red is the disturbed footprint. So that's the part of the lease that's, you know, the ground has been dug up and uranium has been pulled out of the ground, and you know, there's no native vegetation left in those places. So we've defined what we call the reference ecosystem, which is an area that's within 10-kilometer radius of that disturbed footprint. Not everywhere within that 10-kilometer radius is something we would call a suitable reference ecosystem. There's a lot of it that's Arnhem Land Plateau, which is sort of a sandstone escarpment, which just has different vegetation types and sort of different drainage characteristics that don't appear to be suitable for what the goal of the site is. So just to frame that, you know, obviously with the place is surrounded by Kakadu. Kakadu is Australia's largest national park. It's been inscribed onto the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1981 for its cultural and ecological values. It's been continuously inhabited for over 60,000 years, has Ramsar listed wetlands, some of which are located directly downstream of the mine. Has a diverse range of ecosystems if you've been there. I'm sure most of you have, which includes 1/3 of Australia's bird species and about 1/4 of the freshwater fish species. So how do we define a reference ecosystem? So a reference ecosystem is saying, okay, what's your target end state, right? So luckily there's an international organization, the Society for Ecological Restoration, that has a handbook on how you do this. And the first principle of defining a reference ecosystem is that ecological restoration practice is based on an appropriate local indigenous reference ecosystem. So sitting up underneath that definition, or underneath that principle is a definition, but a reference ecosystem is a model adopted to identify the particular ecosystem that's the target of the restoration project. And this involves describing the specific compositional, structural, and functional ecosystem attributes requiring reinstatement before the desired outcome, i.e. the restored state, can be said to have been achieved. So that I highlight those compositional, structural, and functional words because it gives us a bit of a roadmap for us to say, okay, what do we need to measure? We need to measure things like species composition. What about structure? That's like, you know, in my world that means 3-dimensional structure, but some people might think of the might think of that in other ways. You know, the trophic structure, etc. And function may be, you know, things like the flow of nutrients, the flow of energy through that ecosystem. So that is defined in this wheel here, which comes from that Society for Ecological Restoration, where they've divided the different aspects of an ecosystem in their minds up into this sort of 6-sided wheel, where each of the sort of wheels represent parts of an ecosystem or a restored ecosystem that you'd want to be measuring and have some level of confidence in that it's, you know, in terms of measuring ecosystem restoration success. So how do we do that? Our approach is sort of this multi-scale approach where we look, and this is, I'm talking about the entire organization, not just myself, but we're looking from genes to entire landscapes. So for each of these parts of the circle, I've outlaid it with some approaches that we're using to measure and understand those aspects of the restored ecosystem, and in our case, a reference ecosystem. So for an example, for structural diversity, we're using omics approaches. So, you know, genomics, metabolomics, etc. We're using fauna surveys and drone mapping. So that, you know, we're getting all vegetation strata back into the site, are all trophic levels represented and what's the spatial mosaic? Does the place look like? Is it arranged in a way that's that appears to be natural in the sense of what we'd expect for a savanna woodland? So our approach within sort of the vegetation area, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, in terms of multi-scale approaches, we started off in 2018 or so by measuring a bunch of 1 hectare plots. These plots were randomly distributed throughout that reference ecosystem area using a stratified random design. There's a lot of historical data in terms that we had to sort of work our way through in terms of vegetation surveys in the region that have gone back, 40 plus years. But we did, we tried to work through that data, and there had been a fair few different analyses, and trying to frame that data into one common sort of set that would say, is this how we can describe this ecosystem? Became quite difficult, and can we use this description of that ecosystem to inform restoration? And that was virtually impossible, at least in a stakeholder engagement sense. So we centered on an approach of 1 hectare plots, and we use a standardized Oz plots method. So that gives you a complete overstory census of that 1 hectare block. So it's a 100 meter by 100 meter block of savanna woodland. There's a set of understory transects that occur. There's soil sampling for nutrient cycling rates and things like that. So we stratified our sampling design by fire history. We know fire is a major player in terms of structuring what a savanna woodland ecosystem looks like. So we looked at a range of fire histories and stratified our sampling design like that. And we selected, or we were stratified the sampling regime to only focus on areas with slopes that are similar to the final landform. So basically trying to mimic the drainage sort of situations that will be expected in the amount of water logging, et cetera. For proximity, we selected that within 10 Ks of the mine, and obviously excluded places that lack contemporary disturbance. So distance from tracks and roads, and obviously mine-related activities in the town of Jabiru. On top of that, we've been building a program to collect multi-temporal drone data captures, scaling out from tens all the way up to thousands of hectares surrounding that reference, or within that reference ecosystem. So that's sort of the next layer up, which I'll get to. So the objectives of that approach are to characterize the ecosystem to guide restoration, and to track the progress of restoration, recognize threats, and evaluate management, the success of management actions over time. So here's a map of those plots. You can see the mine in the middle. I think there's 10 or 12 of them, or up to 14 at the moment. 10, I think 12 actually. Anyway, there's just a picture from a selection of them. They look like very standard scenes that you would see if you just landed in the middle of the bush in the savanna woodland in Kakadu. There's nothing that seems extraordinary about them, and that's not the point of this restoration project. It is to restore a site back to something that's mundane looking, in the sense of what does a Kakadu savanna woodland look like. What do they look like from a sort of species or perspective? So what I've done here is I've taken 10 of those plots and I've just broken them down by genus. And this is just a spatial arrangement of those trees and their size by basically the diameter of their trunks. And this just gives you some sort of idea of the variability that in terms of the spatial arrangement and in terms of the sort of species arrangements and diversity that you might see. So some of the plots have a lot of trees and are quite dense. Some of them are thinner, which is quite normal in these ecosystems. So we're glad that we can show that variability because we know that exists, and we know that we're at least beginning to capture that. But we're doing it at 1 hectare, and we know that variability and that spatial arrangement occurs at variable scales across the landscape. So this is our first cut at that data and what it looks like. Here's the understory. So these are from these transects across those plots. So we have that sort of 100 meter by 100 meter hectare block. And this is by genus. So you can see that some of the plots, like these two up here, have a fairly unique sort of understory assemblage, and the others have sort of fall into a slightly different assemblage. It's also commonly what we see in ecosystem in savanna woodlands. So from a structural standpoint, we can look at those plots and how they're sort of related to one another across multiple different metrics. So the top left, I had something like I've understory cover plotted compared to the proportion of overstory cover. So there's a bit of a relationship there, but it's you know, it's messy. People have looked at that over time at various scales in savanna woodlands, and you know, they see that there is some sort of relationship between the amount of overstory cover you have and the amount of understory cover you have. But because the two of them are sort of competing with one another. How does diversity go? If you have overstory diversity, this is your tree layer versus your understory shrub layer. There's also a bit of a scatter shot there. On the bottom left, you have basal area, that's basically woody biomass relative to overstory cover. No surprise, a nice positive relationship across the plots. The more woody basal area you have, the more overstory cover you have. That's not surprising. But the relationship between basal area and stems per hectare, there's multiple ways you can get to it. So you can have a high basal area with as low as 500 stems per hectare and as many as 2,000 stems per hectare. So you have that range of density of overstory of tree stems in a given plot. So is that the best we can do, right? Can we just describe 10 hectares or 15 hectares? We need to put 1,200 hectares of restored ecosystem back onto this place. It's probably, you know, can we expand outwards, right? So I bring up this paper that was put out. It's a bit of an inside paper from Carla Staver, who studies savanna ecosystems, mostly in Africa. But she described this scenario where you go out and you put plots and you're measuring things in a plot-based scenario, and specific to savannas, and the types of arrangements of the overstory trees and understory plants and grasses that you find in savannas. And she shows that you can have individually randomly distributed trees, or you have spatially and temporally stochastic processes. So these are where the trees are sort of arranged in clumps as a result of randomness in the environment versus sort of the trees are randomly distributed. And over on the right, we have some self-organizing patterns. So that could be from things like wind throw, you know, predation, herbivory, and things like that. So you can see that in each of those sort of panels, that if you go out and you place two randomly distributed plots, what you measure is, you know, and the information you pull back out of that, it can be quite variable. So you know, we see that in savanna woodlands as well. Not quite to the example that they have in savannas that are much sparser than we have, but so that lets us think: do we need to think bigger? Which leads me to another paper that was put out by James Kellner, we're in the Journal of Botany, American Journal of Botany, called "The Case for Remote Sensing of Individual Plants." So this is where we're looking at, you know, remote sensing has been a field for a long time, you know, going back a number of decades now. And it's always been about measuring sort of landscape scale responses, sort of continental scale responses, and those sorts of things. But we're getting to the point, you know, using drones and other technologies that we can start to think, oh, well, can we measure what individual plants are doing through time? So how does that work? I've sort of put this schematic together. Other people have thrown things like this together before, where you're measuring the different sort of things that the different aspects that you might measure while you're doing remote sensing. So on the left, on your biggest scale, you might want to study ecosystem processes. If you drill down a little bit, you might want to get to community structure. Next level down, you might want to get to demographics, like tree demographics. And then finally, you want to know about individual plants. So different types of platforms and sort of measurement capacities, satellites will get you the big stuff. Sort of crewed aviation get you somewhere close to community structure and potentially demographics with newer levels of sensors. Drones, which is what I love. I'm here to teach you that you can sort of get across the board, all of them. And your sort of terrestrial-based systems like backpack scanners and laser scanners probably do quite well in terms of demographics and individual plants. Community structure can potentially be done with a hell of a lot of walking around, a lot of footwork. And ecosystem processes, you still have to think about multiplying back up to get to sort of what's happening at a larger level. So scaling up from drones, our sort of approach is to moving up from those 1 hectare plots that were ground surveyed to sort of a whole of site concept. So we're going to couple ground-based surveys, multi-rotor sort of surveys, that's sort of what when you think of a drone, which is sort of a quad or hexcopter, which I have a picture of down there, where you can get sort of 1 to 10 sort of hectares at a time, to VTOL, which is a vertical takeoff and landing drone. So it takes off like a drone and then flies like a plane. And they can, survey easily, hundreds of hectares in a given survey. So what does that look like for us? This is just a schematic. Drone flies overhead. This is the fun part of my day when it works. When we do that, we can measure ecosystem processes like respiration. You can measure photosynthetic rates across an ecosystem, sort of in a similar fashion, the way that people are measuring those sorts of things from satellite-based systems. Then you can get to sort of your demographics. You can create a canopy height model. So how tall are the trees across that ecosystem? Where are there stands of taller trees and stands of shorter trees? What do those look like from a demographic standpoint? Can we link some of that back to some of those larger ecosystem processes that are occurring? Canopy height models have been derived for a long time using all kinds of different survey methodologies. From a drone, we can do that quite simply. The next step, drilling down, is looking at individual trees. So from drones, we have, sort of the capacity to measure things like tree heights, diameters, canopy structure. And these are structural measures I'm talking about here in this case, in terms of going into a data set and basically pulling out each individual tree and saying how tall is that tree and tracking it through time. The next step down, which is still sort of in development in the science, is to look at individual phenology of those trees. So you're looking at things like flowering and fruiting and foliar chemistry. So things like nutrient cycling or the rates of photosynthesis from an individual tree, respiration rates and things like that. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about LiDAR, which is laser scanning, and how we use that as a scaling tool to get up to sort of move from smaller places to larger places, right? So in this case, ask the question, what does the drone see? We have one of our 1 hectare plots on the left. That's just sort of an aerial view of what it looks like from a high up, maybe from 100 meters. On the middle panel is just a raw LiDAR point cloud, and the colors are based on height. So blues are basically the ground, greens are sort of mid-story plants, oranges and reds are your canopy height trees. On the right, all we've done is we've just run what's called a segmentation over that, where we've been able to basically look through that point cloud or through that LiDAR output and say, okay, find us individual trees and segment them out so we can identify them or look at them through time. From that segmentation, we can start to measure things, right? So we can measure things like tree height. So here I've just taken that same plot and I've plotted out tree height relative to crown diameter. So that's a fairly simple metric, and it's also sized by crown volume. So it's not surprising. Taller trees have larger diameters, they have bigger crown volumes. But in savanna woodlands, that's a fairly fixed relationship that we see, and most ecosystems have these sort of fixed relationships. Savanna woodlands especially eucalypt woodlands, have a tendency to have a very wide swath of that relationship because the trees are constantly dropping limbs. So there's a lot of variability. Tall trees definitely have larger crowns to them, but the variability that you see is quite wide. So we're gonna go back to Ranger now, and we're gonna first step in our scaling sort of journey is to look at the Ranger trial landform, which was planted in 2009, 2010. So this is just a little corner off of the side of the mine where 11 years ago they thought, oh wow, we're gonna have to close this place down and we better start to figure out how to grow trees here and how this is gonna work. So they took an area, they created a landform using waste rock substrates. They had a few different treatments depending on the type of sediment that was put down and also the type of trees that went in the ground, whether or not they were fully formed tube stock or direct seeded. So that's where you see these sort of sections here. This area is not that big, it's 6 hectares, so it's about 200 by 100, I think. And just for scale, that's the tailings storage facility at the mine, which is actually now being completely drained and doesn't look quite like that from the air, but that's about a 1K swath of what was water at the time. So this trial landform has been studied over time, almost ad nauseum, but we'll use it as an example here today. So what we can do is we fly drone over it. Doesn't takes 15 minutes to do, 20 minutes max. You can get that same LiDAR point cloud by height. And then we can do that sort of individual tree crown detection where we pull out the individual trees and sort of, here we're just randomly color coding them to give you an idea of where, what's a tree and where they are. And then we can bin them out by heights. So that's just looking at this first section in this case, which was the most successful of the planting trials. So you can see all trees on the left, all trees over 2 meters on the left, and then broken out by various size classes. And here we have their positions in space, just to show them where they are. From there, we can start to do things like track growth and mortality through time. So here we have August 2018, which is sort of the beginning of our LiDAR sort of journey with drones. So one of our first data captures, and here we have June of this past year over the same site. On the bottom are histograms of the height classes across the site. And there's, you can study this all you want, and I can show you in ways that I can, spatially you can see where trees have disappeared, or I can overlay them or show you where trees have grown. But in the data, we see that there has been some demographic shifts just in this site over time. Primarily, you see an increase in well, I guess if we move across, you see that there's fewer smaller trees now than there were in 2018. What happened to them? Some of them probably could have grown up. Some of them could have died. There's been fires, controlled fires on the site, which would probably potentially affect those smaller trees. We know that they have. The same with the 4 to 6 meter size class. The 6 to 8 meter size classes has basically stayed the same, but in this case, we've had an increase in trees that are in the 8 to 10 meter size class. So some of those 4 to 6s became 6 to 8s. Some of those 6 to 8s became 8 to 10s. Same with a smaller spaces, but some of them became 10 to 12s, and just a couple of them have gone to be 12 to 14 meter trees. Now in a savanna ecosystem, oftentimes the canopy will be somewhere between 14 and 20-ish meters high, depending upon where you are. So this is 10 years into the process. But when we start to do this scaling, what do we lose, right? So on the left, I have an image of a single tree or cross section from a tree that was scanned by a terrestrial laser scanner. So this is a fixed scanner. You can measure, if you're working really hard, you can probably do 5 hectares a day. You get a very, very clear picture of your world. You can see extreme detail. In the center image, we have a backpack laser scanner, which is basically a similar thing, but it sits on someone's back, usually on my back, and I walk around for an hour or two until I can't take it anymore. And working hard, you might get 25 hectares a day, if maybe not this time of year, but. And then on the left, you have a drone laser scan. So you can see as you move from left to right, you start to lose some resolution, but most people on the right, by the time you get to the right, they'd say, yep, that's still a tree, right? We know we're scanning a savanna ecosystem. So but in the bottom panel, we have things like, this is the cross-sectional area of the tree at 1.3 meters, which is the diameter of breast height measurement, which has been traditionally used by foresters and botanists to measure sort of how large a tree is as a basic measurement. Doesn't work as well for savanna ecosystems, but it's used around the world. So the terrestrial laser scanner, you can see it forms a very nice circle around that tree. You can measure a highly accurate diameter from that data. Gone are the days where someone has to walk around with a tape measure and measure in each individual tree if you want to go down the route of using a terrestrial laser scanner. The backpack will give you that same circle. It gets a little fuzzy, but with some nice math and some understanding of how fuzzy that circle is relative to, say, your terrestrial laser scanner. You can also measure those diameters. When you get to the drone laser scanning, all bets are off. It's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to pick out. There's a few points that show up, and that's about it. So we did some of that work with Sean Levick, came out earlier this year, and sort of learning about how you scale between those different data sets. And as you sort of go up in size in terms of or go up in area covered, how do you start to think back about what you're losing in terms of data, in terms of resolution? The other way to think about it is scaling up through time. So this is work that we did in the last few years. building on a long-term data set of aerial imagery. This is going back a step. And this is from a data set that goes back from 1950 until the present, doing routine aerial imagery captures over the mine in the region. And from that, we've been able to pull out essentially canopy cover. So unfortunately, we didn't have drones in 1950 or 1987 or 2007 for that matter. So we relied upon this very cool aerial photo data set that we have. And from that, we can pull out canopy cover over time, right? So here I just show on the right, it's basically, and what you see, actually what you see on the left is these black polygons, and those are areas of where that reference ecosystem really does occur, where the slopes are correct and where it's the right sort of vegetation types that have been agreed to be put back in the mine. On the right, it's I've basically just transposed those same polygons and put them down, and now I've colored them according to the main percentage canopy per hectare, canopy cover per hectare. So you see as high as sort of 50–60% canopy cover in a hectare, and as low as sort of in the single digits. And it's variable through space and time, as you can see. Well, it's variable through space, as you can see here. When we look through time, what does that look like? So here's each of these stacked histograms are basically shows the proportion of woody cover through time from 1950 to the last data capture that we used for that study in 2016. And the mean is almost always between 30% and 35% canopy cover. It's very fixed in those 66 years of data. That it's over that sort of 1,700 hectares, that canopy cover is always sitting within that range. And it's spatially quite variable, but we see that the mean is apparent, and it's living sort of in that defined range. The same is also true for that sort of variability. So I've also plotted the standard deviation of woody cover. So within across the entire 1,700 hectares that we've selected for our data, the standard deviation is sort of, in that term, that's a measure of how much variability there is over, spatially, is sort of sitting in, within a relatively narrow margin. The 1950 data set has always been a little bit of a troublesome one because the resolution's been obviously is not as good as it is today. So now we're going to scale up the next level up. We're going to go look at Naberlik mine site. So Naberlik is 62 k's northeast of Jabiru. So we're over in West Arnhem Land now. It's mined in 1979 for all of 5 months, right? So this is a shallow uranium deposit. It was very, very rich. All they basically had to do was scrape off the surface material and just start digging, and they were into rich uranium ore. They stockpiled it on the site. It took them 8 years to mill it. They put a nearly 2,000 meter long runway there to fly people in and to fly uranium ore out. So heavy lift cargo jets were coming in there, and they were taking uranium ore out. I'll sort of try to situate you on this aerial image. Here's the existing, well, what's left of the mill right here. This is where the iron, I keep saying iron, the uranium ore was found, or the deposit was here. They created a waste rock dump. So after they finished processing, there's waste rock that's left over, which is a significant volume of the material is still left. They started piling it up on site there to eventually be filled back in. And they had very large evaporation ponds, which are these darker areas here, and various other stockpile areas where the ore were. So these evaporation ponds, when you, I'm not a chemist, but when you process uranium, there's a lot of chemicals involved, and there's a lot of wastewater that's involved, and the water needs to be contained on site and treated, evaporated down to certain levels, et cetera. So all of these sites have sort of evaporation ponds, tailing storage facilities. Mines around the world all have them typically. And it's basically, you're trying to contain that waste and sort of process it over time. So that they're often difficult to rehabilitate, or often require special measures for rehabilitation. So here's just a video of that site. So here we're back looking, let's see if I can go back here, basically from right around here, and I'm going to fly over to this area, then along this edge, and then back out again. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like on the, well, sort of from 50 meters above the ground. So we're flying over right in the foreground here is sort of a bit of a riparian area. relatively undisturbed. And then in the background, you can see that dark area. Those are those evaporation ponds. And you'll get a close up of them in a moment. And further beyond that is what's left of the airstrip and still relatively intact and potentially could be used for emergency situations. But that has nothing to do with ecosystem restoration. So now we're coming up on those evaporation ponds. So this is just to give you an idea of what it looks like. There's no science to be had here. You can sort of form an opinion on how things are going in a site like this. Remember, this was planted in 1995, so we're looking at 25 years ago, and what it looks like as a result today, or as of 12 months ago when I took this video. When I get off to as we proceed further to the right, these are undisturbed areas off back here, so that gives you an idea of what things could have looked like before the mine was present. You often see these large, especially this site, large tracks where usually cattle and horses and donkeys are accessing the site. And now we'll just pan back across. It's a nice place to go visit if you want to look at the scenery, but the grounds up close are not necessarily up to par. But so that's what this Nabelik mine site sort of looks like, to give you an idea of it. And this will just end up right over what's left of the mill. And there's some infrastructure that was left on the site and it was agreed to be left there permanently because of contamination issues, and transporting it would be supposedly too difficult to get out of there. So it's been left. You'll see that come up in a minute. There it is. And those waste rock dumps in the pit are just off there where that gray rock is. So this gives you an idea of Nabelik has never been declared as a successful mine site restoration, but we use it as a test case. We don't like to say what could go wrong, but how things could look. What are the potential outcomes? And then I did the same thing again. So one quick video. This is a native savanna woodland, just in the middle of Kakadu. I say native, natural savanna, relatively undisturbed. This is in March. This is to the west, or to the east of the mine of Ranger. Yeah, I probably took that from 30 meters above the ground. That's just to give you an idea of sort of what an relatively undisturbed ecosystem looks like relative to what you just saw. So back over to Nabelik. Like I said, we have those evaporation ponds, the undisturbed woodland out to the south here. The pit, which is where they dug, the waste rock dump, which is where they piled up large, enormous quantities of rock, and an undisturbed riparian area. So what we've done is fly that area with LiDAR, which is about 250 hectares in total, maybe 300 here, given the whole thing. We've created a canopy height model, right? So here we go. Greens are basically ground, or your lowest level. In this case, 0 meters in a fixed sense, or sorry, in a corrected sense. And your yellows, oranges, and reds are trees. You can look at that and say, okay, well, ignore the airstrip, which is in the center. It's always been cleared, and that's for emergency landing purposes, so the planes could potentially see it and land there. But as you look around the site, the undisturbed woodland, you start to see, okay, you can get an idea of the tree densities and things like that. Undisturbed riparian area, the same thing. Here's those evaporation ponds that we flew over and that had that dark substrate. There's the pits and the waste rock dump. So from that, what we can do is we can then go look at those tree heights and basically plot them out. And this is area corrected as well. So those are those two evaporation ponds on the top two panels there. Then we have the pit, that riparian area, which is undisturbed, the woodland, which is undisturbed, and then the waste rock dump. So these are the two that sort of, for all practical purposes, are your sort of natural sort of look at things. Maybe what you would use as a bit of an end state, how what that could look like. And these are corrected, so the heights of them are on like I said, on a per hectare basis. So few trees means few trees per hectare. So obviously the evaporation ponds like you saw in the imagery, don't have very many trees on them. And then from, so where you are on the x-axis looks at basically the distribution of those trees across all heights. So in places like the woodland, which is the blue, you see there's sort of a mixed demographics of trees, from small trees to large trees. Places like the evaporation ponds, like especially Evaporation Pond 1, we see very few small trees. There's some trees that have survived. And we've, subsequent studies have shown that there's virtually no recruitment there. So no small trees are coming in within the last 25 years to start to fill in. So what about composition? So this is sort of our next step, because this is where we, where I guess I don't want to call it the cutting edge, but it's kind of where we're focusing a lot of our time, and where we, I don't know, I don't want to say it keeps us up at night, but it sort of does, because we have botanists who go out on the ground, and they can identify every single tree to every species. They can identify every grass and herb and shrub on the ground, and that gives us incredibly rich data sets. But scaling that up is very difficult for us to do, and in the sense of operationalizing it. So what's our approach? On the left, here's our savanna woodland. What we've done is we're flying it overhead with a drone. In this case, we basically process up that imagery sort of, the next day, that night in some cases. And we create polygons around what are the trees, and what's everything else. So we usually typically wait for time of year when the grasses are either burned off or senesced, so we get sort of green trees versus brown everything else. And then we have our botanists go out, and they basically are looking at that image, or an image similar to that on the screen. They're walking around with ArcGIS and a laptop. They have a GPS dongle plugged in, so their position shows up on ArcGIS in real time. And they're identifying they're identifying these polygons that you see here to what species they are, right? So that's giving us a rich training data set, feed into an AI model, which we're working with Microsoft to try to get off the ground. So we're started off with our plots because we know them well, but we're going to have to quickly move out and move beyond that to get more data and expand out to get more and more training data. And this is a highly seasonal activity. These trees show lots of seasonality. Obviously, they fruit and they flower and they lose leaves and etc. So what does this look like? From the air, this is our sort of latest sort of drone, which is a DJI M300. Doesn't matter what it is to anyone else but me, maybe to Hamish as well. We're using what's called a P1, Zenmuse P1 camera. It's 45 megapixel. It's 60 to 80 meters above the ground. Every single pixel is basically 1 centimeter. We can fly it as low as 40 meters off the ground, which is 20 meters above the canopy. Then you're getting sub-centimeters, like 0.6, 0.7 centimeters per pixel. So I can zoom in on these images. Someone like Jay, who's sitting in the front row as a botanist, can he knows these trees pretty well. He can start to pick them out, no problem. We don't need to, he no longer needs to walk around with the laptop in the field and look at my polygon, or look at the polygon that we've automatically generated. He can sit in the comforts of his office and start to just label up these trees and from the imagery or from a mosaic of those imagery. We can zoom in further. We can look at individual leaves basically now, and if there are small morphological differences, a botanist will start to key in on pretty well. And from the AI standpoint, this type of resolution data starts really, if you talk to a computer engineer, software engineer, they're like, okay, we can make sense of this. The tree that's on the left is different from the tree on the right. You can see that. You can see the differences in the shapes of the leaves. You can see the differences in the greenness. The computer can also see that. So that's where we're going. Just a quick sort of thing of how that works. So the tree, the first step is to create, we have our imagery on the left, and on the right, we're basically creating polygons around those trees. For better or worse, savanna ecosystems are very, have highly variable trees. Small trees that are different species grow underneath larger trees that are from a different species. So you get these crazy arrangements. So you often have these polygons that are sort of overlapping, and it is a difficult exercise, but it's something that we're pursuing because of the value that it has for us. Even further, we can zoom into ground level, and then we start to even just to think about things like ecosystem processes. So you can measure things like how many dead leaves are on the ground. You can come back there a year later and say how many leaves are on the ground again. that may give you an idea at scale. Things like litter decomposition rates, which are typically measured like by people putting out litter bags on the ground, coming back a year later and seeing how many leaves are still there. Well, if you can do that sort of if you can start to build those relationships and scale them out, that becomes a pretty powerful tool in the restoration sense. So putting it all together, it's my last slide. We're basically attempting to what I call cohesively measure across spatial and temporal scales to describe the structure, composition, function. I didn't really talk about it, but the resilience and sustainability aspects of restoring ecosystem. I can't say it enough, but the ground surveys are like the gold standard. But in this case, the project size and scope demands that we move to tools that cover more appropriate spatial scales. And for that, the type of themes for that are drone-based remote sensing, sensor arrays on the ground, things like bioacoustics, where you're measuring or you're monitoring and listening for the presence of birds returning to the site, camera trapping for fauna, omics for getting soil biota, things like that, eDNA as another tool, and iDNA, which is using insect vectors such as mosquitoes to collect DNA for you. Which in some cases probably tells you that there's a lot of buffalo out there. I don't know. So as a final sort of closing, our overarching theme is to leverage emerging tech and analytics for faster processing and knowledge sharing, which our goal is to feed that back to management decision making, hopefully to improve outcomes. For such an important project that has many people have their eye on. So thanks for your time.
Any questions?
Alan.
Thanks, that was great. So you're putting together a really impressive and precise set of data on the surrounding vegetation. It's not quite clear though how you're going to use that to answer that fundamental question: is the rehab similar to it? What's the thought there? So that traditionally you do just do a plot based and you work out is that plot similar, but you've got much multi-scale data. So how are you proposing to address that fundamental question?
I think my thought is to always that we're creating this sort of envelope of the way that of data of where these ecosystems sort of live. So things like the canopy cover example, over time and over spatial scales, we see that it's a bit of a rule that these systems currently, the way they are, their mean over large enough spatial scales like 35% canopy cover, right? And that's at a scale similar to what we'd expect at the mine. So you can create an envelope around that and say, well, is 25% acceptable? I don't know. Is that similar? I'm not sure, but at least we have this data set that says, and I have a quantitative background. I can tell you, and you know the statistics of that and how those things work. But whether or not what means similar, that's a difficult question to answer. But our approach is to create this sort of cloud of data, if you will, and say, okay, this is where these ecosystems function, and look, this is what they look like. This is what the target should be. And if it's a big target, that's fine. If it,
Yeah, I guess the reason I ask that is that there is a bit of a danger of you collecting far more precise data than you need.
Sure.
I guess that's without being clear from the start how you're actually going to make the comparison and at what you might end up. So, for example, if it's a matter of, well, we just want to make sure that canopy cover is within the range. Well, it's very easy just to document a range, isn't it? That you don't need to do all this to document a range. And anyway, I'm just wondering, it might be worth thinking more about how you're actually going to answer that question, and then let that drive.
And that's
the
true.
Necessary precision of what you
I think
what you measure.
I can't speak on behalf of the mine operator by any means, but I think from my conversations with them, which are regular, they're interested in sort of today engineering solutions, which means things like, how many species per hectare do we need of trees to go onto the site? And I can tell them like an absolute number, or I can say on average, plus or minus this many trees per species is what we see. So because they need to know that information to get what they need to get into the ground. Now, whether or not that gets to the ultimate outcome, I can't say, but at the current state of restoration at that site, they're looking for data that can drive, that they can operationalize per se. So that, I mean, that drives some of that plot-based sort of research, which is highly prescriptive, but we always present that in a, well, I didn't present it here, but we present it to the mine operator and to stakeholders as an envelope of data to say, yeah, stem density is like this, you know, species richness per plot or per hectare is like that. So yeah, you know, without being prescriptive, we try to be to try to create that envelope of where those how those ecosystems are sort of operating. But it is a difficult question. What's similar? Yeah. I'd like to think if I was there 40 years ago, I would have thought more about the question than someone else did, but I can't answer that. Right. Because obviously it's led to lots of discussion and thought as a result. Oh, sure, Sean.
So I guess this is giving a lovely detailed sort of picture of the understory.
Yep.
What about the understory? Sort of how can these sort of technologies help there?
We're tinkering around and thinking about how to fly drones under the canopy carefully, and you know, we've had to play with it. And I mean, we want to get there where we're taking, you know, where we're collecting imagery, high resolution. Obviously, you know, you're close enough to it at that stage. You can, if you drop a 45 megapixel camera, 5 meters above it, you'll see every blade of grass and every flower and everything else. But scaling those up I think is going to be difficult just because of that. Well, in some reason because of the diversity that you find. So, you know, in the overstory, there's, you know, 15 or 20 species comprise 90% of the individual stems, where in the understory, aside from, you know, sorghum, there's a, you know, a tremendous diversity. So picking that up from a drone is probably, we're not there yet. So, and in some ways you know, maybe it's because of where they are with restoration, but you know, they're focused on getting those trees back in there first. And I mean, the understory is, you know, it's part of the plan, and it's you know, in the works, but at the same time, the understanding of it in terms of its function and structure and in terms of a restoration sense is kind of puts the mine operator sort of, I don't know, it's a little bit further down the road for them, I would say at this stage. But and for us, you know, we're going to rely upon ground surveys for understory for a long time to come, if I had to predict.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Lindsay?
Right,
Thanks, Brittany. Hi, Dave. Great talk. Thanks, Dave. I was interested in your third dot point function. How you're going to get it function using your current approach. And I mean, to my mind, function is important, because if you've got a regenerating site that's dysfunctional, you might have some trees out there or some architecture you can measure with a drone, but you may have a stalled restoration or not. And I guess function means sequestration, water use, efficiency, nutrient cycling, phenology, flowering fruit, and blah 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 blah. How are you sort of proposing to
I mean, from the drone
get
base,
that there, or is that just there for?
From the drone basis, you know, for us, that's fruiting and flowering. So
Right,
which is, you know,
that sort of,
you know, which is I guess a byproduct of a functioning. Well, we hope to be a byproduct of a function. I mean, it's showing you that something must be working, right? You know, we're having reproductive successes here, hopefully. You know, recruitment is another one. Yeah, and you know, the soil-based measurements from, you know, the omics perspectives, I think, are sort of driving a lot of that as well. So we go out and dig a hole in the ground and say, well, what are the soil biota doing here? What genes are being expressed?
Yeah.
You know, that's well outside my expertise, but it's, you know, stuff we're thinking about in the organization and actively pursuing is, you know, trying to link function, well, structure and composition with function to say.
okay. But you'd need a lot of that in your undisturbed sort of reference sites.
Oh yeah, I mean, it wouldn't, you know, I mean, the team was out, you know, once again, like Jay was out a couple of weeks ago digging holes in the, you know, reference ecosystem, which is, you know, we've done that repeatedly through time. I mean, obviously there's a lot of historical data that's highly relevant in that, especially in that instance. But in, you know, those new approaches, I think that they hold a lot of, they don't, you know, they may not crack every sort of question that we have left, but they definitely hold the promise to, you know, to provide that next level linkage where you go from, you know, okay, we have nutrient cycling, but, you know, what's causing it, or, you know, what's the driver behind it? Is that, you know, is that soil biota similar to what you see outside? Does that matter? I don't know. That's the next question, right? If you have a totally different soil biota, but the same level of nutrient cycling, because you have a different soil chemistry driving something. So, yeah.
Has anything like that been looked at Narberlek? Is Narberlek a stalled system? Is it recovering? Didn't look like
yeah, it's probably stalled sideways. Yeah, I mean,
It did get smashed by Monica too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah.
Sure.
Went out there when I was first flying, yeah.
But so did a lot of other undisturbed areas.
Yeah.
It's part of the natural disturbance regime where you guys are.
So, well, I mean, that resilience thing is, and Narberlek has been torched, you know, and the region has, you know,
Yeah, it looked
the
like you had a
local
big
region of
fire.
Narberlek gets pretty smashed.
But I mean, the soil processes in the Narberlek site were very interesting.
Yeah. So we've taken those samples. I haven't looked at that data yet, but we took it a lot 2 years ago.
Terms of,
Yeah. When we flew those sites with our soil sample.
Sure.
So,
But eDNA surveys would be very informative.
Yeah.
What microbial populations are currently in there in the dry and the wet
yeah, exactly.
versus your reference sites.
Yeah. So, and I mean, a place like Narberlek is, you know, there's a long history there. There's, you know, a lot to work your way through. And there's a PhD student at UQ is working tirelessly on that at the moment. But it's, you know, a site like that is, you know, a bit of a, I just use it as a marker to say, you know, I mean, it is, it's not a mark, it's a marker in the sense of Ranger, because Ranger is a lot larger and has a lot more eyes on it, but that doesn't mean we should forget about Narberlek. Unfortunately, the eyes aren't on that site and the resources aren't in place, and, you know, certain entities either dropped the ball or just didn't. It never had the, you know, sort of the remit to restore. It was like, it's, you know, it was a goal to get it back, you know, restored to something similar to the surrounds, similar, you know, but that doesn't mean the resourcing or the legislative sort of kick was ever there to do it. So it's like we'll try this out and then we'll see how it goes.
And what was the waste rock at Narberlek? Was it similar?
It's very similar on the
So
waste
what's
rock.
going to be on the, say, the
Well,
trial
the evaporation ponds are much bigger than, well, in terms of area. Those evaporation ponds are probably the most, you know, they show the hardest sort of ability to grow anything. It's highly compacted and, you know.
The lessons have been learned.
Yeah.
In terms of the preparation.
Definitely, yeah.
Critical.
The lessons have been learned, and now it's time to think about how to apply them.
Thanks.
Yep.
Time for one more question. Anyone?
That analysis you did with the satellite imagery going back to the 50s, and you said the first time period was really different than the others, but was it 2010 was also?
2010 was a different camera system, so there's been some correction had to go into place, and that was a
It definitely looked like it was skewed off.
Yeah, that was a worldview 2 data set instead of airborne. So
Yeah.
There was a lot of corrections that had to go into each sort of data set to get the ground sampling distances lined up and things like that. So there is some caution there, but over time and at a sort of a gross scale, the patterns start to emerge.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Glenn.
And just, we're having drinks outside. It's very cheap. So please